Hi, I'm Nick Haig and welcome to the B2B Insights podcast. Here today I'm going to talk to you about B2B emotions. We're terming it winning with emotion, how to become your customer's first choice, because very often we hear in the consumer marketplace about the importance of emotions, and that in a business-to-business context then it's all about rational decision making. But actually what we're going to share with you today is some of the key insights from our own survey, and with me today is one of my colleagues, Connor, who's here to talk us through this. So let me ask you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, hello everyone. Delighted to be part of this first podcast episode. I'm Connor and I'm a director of B2B International. I'm a career market researcher and a career B2B market researcher at that, so that's probably quite an uncommon thing in today's world. So delighted to talk about the results of our State of B2B survey here. And
I think what we have got is a really interesting piece of research. We're a research company, and so we put money where our mouth is and did our own piece of research for this thought leadership piece. And we spend our daily lives trying to understand business decision makers out there and why people do what they do. And so could you give me and the listeners a bit of background to what we actually did with this piece of research?
Absolutely. I think to take a step back to the reason why we did this, I think we as market researchers have immersed ourselves in trying to understand business decision makers for years and years, and for many of our clients. And many of the projects that we've conducted over the years have touched upon the role of emotions in B2B decision making. But we didn't feel that we had really hard, robust measurements to be able to apply that to all B2B markets. It was always very specific to one client or one project. We wanted something that we could call our own. Yeah. And so, as you said, we put our money where our mouths are, and we came up with this global study that covered lots of ground. Emotions and the B2B decision-making process was one part of the study, but it was, in my view, the most enlightening result from the project. So, where's the data come from? Well, the project was an online survey of 2,000 business decision makers, and that, just on a high level, gives us a huge amount of scope to analyse the results, to look 1, 2, 3 levels deeper than we might have been able to do with a smaller sample size. Yeah. What it has also meant, and what hopefully we'll cover some of today, is that we can look at regional differences and country differences by the role of the decision maker, whether they're in marketing or procurement or the C-suite, but also the industry that they fall into as well. Are they a manufacturing company? Are they a business services company? And so from that sample of 2,000 people, 2,000 business decision makers, comes a huge amount of opportunity for us to look into the intricacies of business-to-business decision making.
And I know there's some very interesting things that have come out of it, and as you say, we can mine the data and cut it to have a look at lots of different areas. I suppose for today's purposes, for the listeners and for the viewers of the podcast, then we do have this report, and there are specific tailored versions as well for countries and for different industry sectors. But for today's purposes, for the next half an hour at least, we're going to talk about the high level view, aren't we? Right. And I think, from the initial research that we did, we looked at this whole process, the B2B buying process, if you like, from the research and consideration set through to the formal quote, and then what makes that difference? Why does one supplier win against the other, and what are those key emotions that drive that decision in that?
That was really at the heart of the research, Nick, because we felt that companies might feel that they're doing a decent job of becoming part of the consideration set, but that they fall short. And really the theme throughout our paper is how to go from silver to gold, so you don't get any prizes for coming second. Yeah. And so we wanted to structure the research according to a typical, and there is, I appreciate, no typical B2B journey, but if we just think about the high level stages, that trigger, what's causing somebody to first think about the fact that they need to buy a new piece of equipment or they need to procure some new business services, all the way through to developing that idea of which suppliers you might be looking to consider, narrowing that list down all the way through to that really crucial final buying decision. And I think that the idea of understanding how companies can gain a competitive edge at various stages in the B2B buying journey has really come to the fore. We've seen ourselves doing a lot more journey mapping and buyer journey research over the last few years. And I think part of that has stemmed from the idea that traditional methods of engaging with the customer for the first time have started to break down. We saw this back in, I think, 2011 when Google created the term ZMOT, or Zero Moments of Truth. That was really the start of our understanding that the research and the influence on a potential customer, a lot of that, in fact most of it, happens before we might get an opportunity to interact directly with the potential customer, whether it be on the phone or in a sales pitch. In fact, I think our research suggested that something like 58% of all of the information that a prospective buyer needs or wants will happen prior to them picking up the phone and asking to speak to a salesperson or asking to see a sales brochure. So that really was the genesis of the research, wanting to understand, given that environment and given how difficult it is to engage directly with the potential buyer, when we do get that opportunity, we need to make the most of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an important point, especially where we are at the moment with this omni-channel world of how we can speak, the different channels of how we can communicate with our buyers out there. And so I think making sure that sales and marketing work together, because as you say, if the sales are going to come to, if the buyer has already made 50 to 60% of that journey and that decision before they even start to speak to an individual, then the marketing team, the website, all that other marketing collateral needs to have delivered the right message in order to influence them on that journey.
You're absolutely right. I mean, building the brand up front so that your name and your message, your proposition is out there in the absence of being able to have a conversation with the customer directly from your sales team. That's absolutely critical, just in terms of getting in the door, let alone getting all the way to the end of the purchasing journey.
I mean, at the outset, one of the interesting facts that really hit me was the power of the brand. You've talked about journey mapping, understanding those interactions of how the touch points that people make on that original journey. But that brand piece and the brand positioning, was it 95% of the decision is already made or influenced by the brand at that early stage?
That's right. So 95% of the 2,000 decision makers that we surveyed agreed that feeling a sense of connection to a B2B brand is as important or more important even than feeling that the supplier is credible, feeling confident that they can deliver on what they say they can deliver. And I think that was the first myth buster that came out of our survey, because I think for years and years now, most of us, including myself, have just assumed that emotional connection to a brand is much more likely and much stronger in a consumer setting. Yeah. You feel much more strongly about the brand of jewelry or the brand of even pet food or something like that you buy than you might the brand of legal services that you buy. Yeah. Actually, our research suggests that we need to flip that narrative entirely on its head, because of that 95% agreeing that they want to feel that connection to the B2B brand, that is an important part of their decision. But even some research that sits outside of this study suggesting that people feel more strongly, whether that be positively or negatively, to B2B brands than they do to B2C brands. And we've tried to rationalise that, as all researchers do. And I think that the conclusion we've come to is that in B2B environments, the stakes are generally higher. Nobody apart from me and perhaps my wife cares if I come home with a horrible piece of clothing or if I buy a phone that I end up not liking 2 weeks later. I'm not accountable to many other people for that decision. Yeah. Plus the investment is likely to be a lot lower, certainly relative to business investments where you could be spending millions of pounds or millions of dollars on a piece of machinery that's critical to the running of your plant. Yeah. So if you put yourself in that situation and think about how you might feel if that decision went well or if that decision went badly, it's not difficult for us to to conclude that, yes, actually, emotions do run higher in B2B purchasing decisions.
Yeah. Of course, business to business and businesses out there are different from your one-man bands and your smaller SMEs up into your mid-sized companies and your corporates. Did we see any difference in terms of that power of the brand, or the difference there, depending on, because obviously if it's a smaller company, one person might make that decision as opposed to the multiple decision makers in mid-market or corporate-sized companies?
You make a good point, which is to say that our survey covered the whole spectrum of B2B companies, all the way through from small and mid-sized companies up to enterprise decision makers. And there were elements of the survey where we were able to pull out differences by company size. For example, just a random one here, when thinking about the importance of establishing a thought leadership position in order to gain credibility and to build trust and things like that. That came out actually as important for small, mid-sized and large businesses, but even more important for the largest, for the enterprise customers. 40% of enterprise decision makers said that they considered a supplier because of its thought leadership position. And so what we're recommending to a lot of our clients now is that they need to be thinking more about content marketing. It's not just about getting name recognition. It's not even just about building a strong value proposition. It's about showing expertise in as many ways as possible.
Oh, I think aligned to that, and there's a stat in front of me on the book there, that, when we're B2B specialists, we're dealing, with clients that are dealing in that business to business connection there, but equally that can transcend into consumer markets, can't it? And I think maybe less so at the corporate larger end, where thought leadership is more important. But I think what we did find, I think I'm right in saying, is that, at the smaller end, then there was a big influence, or at least a third of business decisions were influenced by their consumer, in the consumer space, whether it's to do with, anti-malware software, Stanley Black & Decker and the tools that they use, and then the tradespeople talking about what they use in a professional capacity.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting finding, because I think the risk that a lot of B2B companies take is to separate the B2B and the B2C divisions and operate them as very, very separate, siloized business units, because of the misunderstanding that these don't touch one another and they're completely different, and we have to sell to businesses in a completely different way than we sell to consumers. Yeah. And while there are elements of truth in that, I do think that if you are in a category, for example, energy or banking or insurance, where you might be selling to businesses as well as consumers, those companies should be mindful of the fact that 99% of all the businesses in the world are small. Yeah. And therefore they're not actually that far removed from their decisions as consumers. As you said, if you're a one-man band, or even if you're the owner of a 25-person company, of course you're going to be drawing upon your own personal experiences. And if you've had a bad experience with your own personal insurance provider, it makes it a lot less likely that you'd be wanting to consider doing business with that company in a B2B context. Yeah,
if your experience is soured, and we know this from our customer experience background, that it's a lot more expensive and harder to win in customers than it is to keep hold of them. And if in that consumer context they have had a bad experience with the billing or the connectivity, then that can definitely feed through.
Definitely.
We haven't got time to go through everything, and there's lots of there is lots of information in here, isn't there? I suppose one thing is, and we've touched on it a bit in terms of that decision-making unit. For some of our listeners, when we're trying to get a message out there, how many different people are making these decisions, and in terms of what messages do we need, and do we need to push different messages to different people in these companies?
I think that's something that a lot of companies have traditionally struggled with. And the easiest thing, of course, to do is to say, who's my customer? Who's my individual customer? Right, well, we deal with the CEO. That's the person that's on our database, and therefore that's the person that makes the decision.
Or procurement, that's...
It could well be that, it could well be. And actually, it's often the case that individual person with whom you might have the most obvious connection is not the person that's responsible for making the final decision, or for shortlisting the supplier, or for endorsing the buying decision. It might just be the person that signs off on the budget. Yeah. And so I think, and a lot of companies are moving towards understanding the broader decision-making ecosystem, if you will. But I think there's still some way to go to communicating effectively with each of those stakeholders. And so just to put some numbers behind this, we asked quite simply how many people are involved in the decision, regardless of seniority or role. If they're just influencing, that would be included there. And as you might imagine, with very small companies, the decision-making unit is much smaller. But even so, almost 80% of SMBs said that somebody other than myself, the main decision maker, is also involved in the decision. And actually sometimes up to 4, 5, 6, 7 or more people, even in a company with maybe 40 employees, were going to be involved in that ultimate decision. The larger the company gets, the bigger and broader that decision-making unit becomes. Companies departmentalise, so the company owner might even become less involved, certainly than they would in small companies, but then you have different function heads. You might have junior employees doing research to inform the decision-making recommendations. So I think the so what to all of this is really that companies need to be thinking about all of these different stakeholders and the messages that need to be communicated, and the points in the journey at which those people become most important, because procurement might be really important at one stage but have nothing to do with all the other stages.
Yeah, and as you say, okay, the C-suite or the person, the CEO might have the final signature, but it comes right at the back end when actually all the other decisions have been made, and he's just been influenced totally by his team or by the many decision makers in there.
Yeah, and it's impossible to win the business, to have that CEO to sign off on you as a supplier, if the junior researcher at the very beginning of the journey didn't put you in his or her list of eight potential suppliers.
Yeah. So, in view of time, and so we can really disclose the key findings that we found out. The junior researcher, as you say, they might start that journey. They might be, doing the research, understanding who offers what, getting that supplier consideration set together, and then, passing that on to maybe their managers, who will start to interact. As you say, look for thought leadership, look at experiences, starting to get, quotes in and things like that. There might be a few people that are influencing on that, and they're reaching out to, at least 4 different suppliers out there. So as we come down to this whole funnel of making this decision, and it comes down to final 2 suppliers, final 2 providers, is that how it would work? And then what was the really key insightful thing that we found that really made the difference in why someone would choose one supplier over another?
Well, imagine you're at the very end of a 100-meter race. So you've already done well to run the first 99 meters and still be in a shot, have a shot of winning it.
Yeah.
But what gets you over the line when you dip your head, what gets you over the line just a centimetre ahead of the competitor, and therefore you win the business rather than losing the business? This is where emotions really come to the fore. The headline from our research was that a supplier's ability to evoke an emotional response with the buyer accounts for 56% of the decision to go with that supplier versus another supplier. Just to put that into a bit of context, that means that most of the influence, most of the final decision is based on how well you've done at producing feelings of confidence, trust, optimism, and pride in the prospect of working with you as a supplier.
So let me just stop you there, I mean, so that's really powerful stuff, isn't it? Because, in a business decision, we're always talking about that rational decision making in terms of, it's they're going to make it on the product quality, the price, that whole, the brand, they've got that experience there. So that, if you like, turns some of that traditional thought on its head, doesn't it?
It does in a way, although what I would say is that we don't want to suggest that emotional and rational are completely mutually exclusive here and diametrically opposed to one another. We're not talking about necessarily people being emotional, as in irrationally making decisions. What we're talking about here is producing an emotional response. Now, in a business context, and those 4 emotions that I referenced before, those being confidence, trust, optimism, and pride, those feelings actually are embedded within very rational considerations. Yeah. So in order to feel, for example, confident in a supplier, you have to think that they are reliable. You have to have had a good customer experience if they're the incumbent. Those aren't necessarily things that are irrational. For example, if a manufacturing decision maker is making a decision on a machine, what might make them feel trusting or confident in the supplier is, to us, a very boring and very technical specification sheet. Now, you wouldn't ordinarily look at that and think, wow, that's going to cause me to be really emotional. But actually, if you think again about the whole business environment behind this decision, making sure that that information is right can make a huge difference to how comfortable you feel with making that decision. So yes, 56% of the final decision is about creating that emotional response, but that doesn't mean that business decision makers are acting and thinking irrationally.
Yeah. So should we take each one of those 4 emotions, if you like, and talk through those? So confidence, I suppose, and some of them are related or interact with each other. So confidence and trust. Should we start with those 2 first of all? So.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing about trust is that it's driven by a feeling that the supplier is reliable. Now that can come from any number of places. So for example, we talked about the incumbency advantage. It's much easier to present to a buyer that you are reliable if you've been reliable with them for 10 years.
Yeah, with experience, that whole, how you do business.
Exactly. So the challenge for the challenger brand, the non-incumbent, is to communicate that through marketing, through brand building, and through any direct interaction that you might be lucky enough to have with the buyer.
Yeah.
One of the other things that we've already touched upon is expertise. We mentioned the importance of building a strong thought leadership position, and that's another great way to build trust, because it shows credibility. It shows that you understand markets, you understand the products, you understand business challenges, and so you're talking to the buyer on a level which resonates very strongly with them and helps them to feel that confidence that you will do a good job.
Yeah. And I think, well, tied to that is, I think it aligned with trust, is it? And it might be, again, that they've got that experience of having done business with you, but that ease of doing business. I know, we often find this, don't we? If you're difficult to do business with, then, obviously that starts to put the blockers up in terms of how you might do business in the future. And does that feed into the digital part of the journey as well? People do need to make it easy, no matter how they're looking to do business.
It does. I mean, of course, an important part of showing that you're easy to do business with is through your personal interactions. So that could be the sales rep or the account manager. But you're right, we shouldn't forget about the ability of your digital channels to create an easy to do business feeling in the customer as well. So whether that be presenting a website that's clear and concise and that enables the person to get to the right information quickly, that can all contribute to somebody feeling a level of trust even before they get to know you really well.
Yeah. So number 1 is trust. And is trust, we're going through these, is any one of these more important than the other? So we've got trust, confidence, optimism and pride.
And that's the order. So trust did come out as the number 1. And actually when we look at that, that's at a global level, but even when we looked at most of the countries, most of the regions, so in APAC, in Europe, in North America, trust was always up there. There was a bit of reordering beneath it, but if you can nail the trust factor, then you're really onto a winner.
Yeah. So we talked trust, confidence. How can companies out there do more to deliver and be seen as confident in the buyer's mind?
Well, this is a tricky one because an important part of building confidence is your brand reputation. And so I always think back to the old saying, "Nobody got fired for buying IBM." Obviously, IBM had to work very, very hard in order to create that reputation. But once they had it, it lasted for a long time. The reason that I bring that up is because if you're a chief technology officer and you're tasked with investing in new hardware for your business, if you recommend IBM, no, at least the saying went, nobody would ever challenge you on that decision. And even if it went wrong, nobody would look at you and say, well, of course it went wrong. You chose this random brand that nobody's ever heard of. In choosing IBM and in recommending IBM as a preferred supplier, you were basically insulating yourself as a decision maker from any blowback or criticism. That in itself gives you a heck of a lot of confidence that you're making the right decision, because you are sort of accountable for that decision. And if you choose a supplier that doesn't have that brand reputation, then if it goes right, fair enough, no one's asking any questions. But if it goes wrong, it falls back squarely on your shoulders. And that's tricky for an individual, regardless of the company's aspirations here. You have to think about the individual's aspirations in making that decision. They want to go with something that they feel safe about.
And I suppose that feeds back to what we've already talked about today in terms of what thought leadership will, but it will always position you as and give you confidence in the marketplace. But going back to that first stat that we started to share, that 95% need confidence in the brand in the first instance.
Yes, absolutely. And another way of doing that, if you don't have the brand, or if you're a challenger brand, having the resources in place to support the customer is another key way of doing that. So an example would be if you're serving a global client and they need you to have operational value chains in 5 different countries, and you can say, well, look, we've been in business in these places for 25 years, we've got offices, we've got distribution centres. All of that narrative is feeding into the customer and helping them to feel confident about you as a supplier.
So we've got trust, we've got confidence. They feel quite different to optimism and pride. When I look at it, trust and confidence are about, as you say, the brand, the company, if you like. And optimism and pride feel quite personal, emotional factors. Would I be right in saying that?
I think you're right there, Nick. I think trust and confidence, we can talk about those in ways that make the buyer feel safe, secure in their decision, whereas optimism and pride are a bit more aspirational. They're thinking about the future, they're thinking about the potential gains from doing business with you as a supplier. So again, I hate to sound like a broken record here, but the thought leadership position helps with that as well, because you can talk about the value that you provide in your thought leadership. Another thing to do is to talk about your problem solving abilities, and you can do that either in theory or you can do it in action. So if the customer has an issue, show that you're proactive, show that you're telling them that you have a solution before they even know that they have a problem. That's, again, easier said than done, especially if you're not already in bed with the customer. But that's definitely an important way of building that feeling of optimism. And then pride is about the buyer projecting themselves forward and thinking about what the supplier can do for me as an individual and my organisation. And so making the customer look like the hero here is very, very important if you can make them look great.
And that's the individual that brought the supplier to the table, if you like, to the company.
Or frankly, going back to the fact that the decision-making unit is quite broad and varied. It could be anyone that has a stake in that decision. Make anybody who's a stakeholder and who is in any way accountable for that decision feel like they're the hero.
So 56% of this final buying decision is based on emotions. Is that 56% all positive emotions, or are there some negative emotions that people need to be wary of, making sure that they counter some of those negative emotions that people can feel out there?
That's an interesting point, and I'll just as a quick reminder, what we've been talking about here is that very, very end part of the race. So if you're producing negative emotional responses in your buyers, you're probably not going to get out of the starting blocks. You're certainly not going to get to the finishing line and in a position to win the race. So in that sense, positive emotions were really strong, much stronger at that very end of the journey. However, it's worth noting that avoiding emotions like uncertainty, skepticism, confusion about your offering, those are really important as well. And it's quite likely that if you've made somebody feel confused earlier on in the journey, that you simply won't have qualified for the next part of the process. But if you get to the end and you're still and the buyer still feels a little unclear about your offering, that really puts you at a disadvantage.
So I think, well, as I say, we needed to make sure that we got the key themes over today, because there's lots of detail that, as I say, can be shared on our website, or they're downloadable in white papers. But let me see if I can try and put this all together and see if it makes sense. So lots of decision making starts with maybe junior people making that first steps with the online researching, and so online resources are really important there to build that consideration set. People are looking at websites, but they're also looking at lots of different channels as well to get that information together. And only then do they start to build that consideration set, of which then they might pass to different people, their managers, to then start to understand the process itself.
Yeah.
And some of those key things that feed into that, of course, the brand, and that consistency. Thought leadership seems to be very important, more important for larger companies than smaller companies, but nonetheless still important for that positioning piece. And then as we go through that journey, there might be some consumer experience that feeds into that, more so probably for the SMEs and the smaller companies. And but this rational versus emotional decision making, it really is about meeting all those rational points first. Obviously you've got to have the right product at the right price, at the right availability, but if when you go to market there's multiple people there, that's when the emotions kick in.
That's right, and it's because emotions are the difference maker. So if you imagine two suppliers that are, in terms of product, price, even how long their brands have been established, let's say, they are completely equal in all ways. But one brand is talking about their product, talking about their offer, their people, in a way that produces that feeling of trust or confidence, optimism, pride in the buyer. That's what helps them to make the distinction. That's what helps them to say, right, well, supplier A is clearly better than supplier B for me, even though you might actually end up spending more money, frankly, because those sorts of things command a premium.
Yeah.
And so you can do much more value selling anyway. But all other things aside, you've delivered me a good product at a good price. How can I distinguish you from another supplier? Well, that's when the emotions kick in.
So if there was one key message that we could leave with listeners for today, in the importance, obviously these emotions are a really impactful takeaway of how we can start to build our messaging and build on these emotions in B2B decision making. But what do you think the one key takeaway is? From where I'm sat, I'm thinking, well, the brand seems to encompass everything here. So
I think so. I think that the pitfall that a company could suffer from is thinking that they can do all of this stuff once they get in front of the customer, once they get on the phone with them or in the room with them. Frankly, if that's the mindset of your company, then you're missing out on a lot of business opportunities because you're just never even entering the consideration set. So just trying to influence your prospective buyers through your marketing and through your brand building before you have an opportunity to directly interact with them is really critical.
Well, I think it's really intriguing, and I think there's lots of gems in there, and there is some differences, as you say, but whether you look at it by geography, by industry sector, but only small differences. The key takeaways are the same whichever way you
Absolutely.
cut the data.
This really feels like a message that resonates globally across all verticals, small, mid-sized, large companies, with some minor differences, of course, but the main message is really consistent.
Yeah. Well, I think to close up today's episode, then I can point you to the fact of, if you go to our website and search for "Winning with Emotion: How to Become Your Customer's First Choice," then there's a white paper there that is free to download. And I think as we'll start to uncover in other episodes of podcasts, we'll start to share with you some of the findings that we see from other surveys, as well as starting to introduce you with various different industry leaders on how they go to market too. But I just need to thank you, Connor, for first of all, bringing this to our attention, but also contributing to today's podcast.
Thanks very much, Nick. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. So you've heard from us, so we'd very much like to hear from you. You can get in touch via Twitter at B2B_insight, and please, comment on what we've found interesting, what we could cover more in the future. Any questions, we'd love to hear from you.